大家好，欢迎来到我们的华尔街争议节目。今天我们要深入探讨的是中国的独生子女世代如何被困于人口金字塔中，面对着庞大的家庭负担和经济压力。随着中国的独生子女政策影响逐渐显现，许多家庭的故事如同职业学校教师刘文迪与丈夫邓杰，两人不仅要抚养自己的孩子，还要照顾年迈的4位父母。面对不断上升的退休年龄和持续的青年失业率，这些夹心饼干世代正在承受着前所未有的3重压力。我们将探讨这一代人如何从童年时期的小皇帝变成了家庭的支柱，却又在经济低迷和人口老龄化的双重打击下苦苦挣扎。随着生活成本上升，这一代人的未来似乎变得越来越暗淡，许多家庭甚至不得不考虑卖掉房产，以应对父母和孩子的高额开支。今天的节目将揭示这些家庭如何在困境中寻找出路，以及中国未来的人口政策可能会对经济造成的深远影响。请大家继续收看详细内容。独生子女世代的双重压力，养育子女与照顾父母的艰难平衡。Wendy Lu 这位47岁的职业学校教师，如今对于接到电话的声音感到恐惧。每一次铃声响起，往往意味着他的父母之一又被送往了医院。无论是患有阿兹海默症的母亲，还是罹患癌症的父亲，任何紧急情况都需要他从工作地点赶回广州家中。这种压力重重的旅程，他已经经历过无数次。刘和她的丈夫邓杰都是中国第一代独生子女，出生于1977年，仅仅晚了1年，中国开始对大多数城市家庭实行一胎政策。他们不仅要抚养2个孩子，还要照顾4位年迈的父母。最近有消息指出，提高退休年龄的政策和持续的青年失业率，让他们担心自己必须比父母工作更长的时间，同时还要为成年子女提供更多的经济支持。这一代人面临的困境在中国越来越普遍，尤其是当他们步入中年。这个被称为夹心一代的群体正因3重压力而不堪重负，父母长寿带来的照护需求延长，子女依赖时间加长，以及经济下行导致的职业挑战。从小皇帝到人口金字塔的基底。在1980年代，第一批独生子女被戏称为小皇帝，因为他们是家庭的唯一焦点。然而，随着他们长大成人，开始建立自己的家庭，这些曾经的家庭君主们发现自己被人口金字塔的顶端压得喘不过气来。根据国家统计局的数据，从1982年到2023年，中国的平均寿命从68岁增加到78.6岁，而65岁及以上人口的比例从 4.9% 上升到 15.4%。同时，青年一代面临着严峻的就业市场，许多人即使毕业后仍需依赖家庭支持。官方数据显示，16到24岁年龄组不包括学生的失业率在8月份上升到 18.8%， 比7月份的 17.1% 有所增加。这些问题让刘和邓的家庭陷入了困境，这种困境在全国各地的家庭中普遍存在，几乎注定会进一步抑制年轻人对婚姻和生育的渴望。经济压力与角色冲突。邓杰曾是一名房地产项目经理，在中国房地产市场长期低迷的情况下，他的收入不再稳定。刘则忙于争取教授职位，这让他几乎没有时间照顾父母。尽管邓的父母健康状况相对良好，他们的年龄增长还是增加了日常照护的需求。我很焦虑，但现实是未来会有更多的护理工作，我无法应付，更不用说开始新的职业生涯，邓说。唯一的解脱可能是其中一位父母去世，但那是令人心碎的。随着邓的收入停滞不前，他们的女儿也无法确定毕业后是否能找到工作，情况变得十分暗淡。他们的2套房产也在贬值。我们的财富已经不足以支付目前的开支，更别提我们老去后的费用了，邓说。这对夫妻的女儿目前在大学3年级，每年需要约10万元，约14251美元来支付学费和生活费。12岁儿子的教育费用也在增加。根据北京大学社会学系的预测，到2030年，城市地区双独家庭的比例将达到 34.2%， 单独家庭将占近 50%。这2类家庭在老年人和儿童的照护上都将面临前所未有的挑战。经济困境与未来不确定性。 我和丈夫的月收入合计今年只有约3万元，比去年少了1/3，我们无法存下1分钱，李伟说。这位80年代末出生的摄影师也是独生子女之一。她和丈夫在深圳生活，父母分别在数百公里外的汕头和数千公里外的盐城。他们还背负着超过90万元的房贷，并要抚养孩子。更糟糕的是，人口老龄化和出生率下降正压制消费，这可能进一步损害中国的整体经济。著名人口经济学家蔡方在北京的一次会议上表示，我们的父母现在60多岁，他们可能会继续做零工，以便为下次生病存点钱。威斯康星大学麦迪逊分校的高级科学家易福贤研究中国人口结构，他认为中国的一胎政策导致退休年龄提高，年轻人口减少，这使得国内需求不足，就业和出口下降，最终限制了经济增长。当其他国家达到中国目前的高等教育入学率时，服务业通常提供70%到80%的工作，但由于消费不足，中国的服务业仅提供45%的工作，易说道。这使得主要从事服务业的大学毕业生难以就业，导致青年失业率高，婚姻和生育率下降。中国的社会保障体系尚未解决这一短缺。根据2022年的数据，只有不到1/3的中国劳工缴纳失业保险，只有1/4的城市失业者实际上享受失业保险。超过一半的退休人员，主要是农村老年人，每月获得的平均养老金仅为205元。人口红利的结束与未来的挑战，这只是人口变动的开始。北京大学的一项研究估计，到2030年，中国将有超过7700万老年人需要长期全日照护。43岁的媒体经理肖辉是深圳的另一位独生子女，他的父母都在70多岁。他的父亲患有干燥综合症和小儿麻痹症，母亲则患有帕金森病，这些病症需要昂贵的药物和频繁的住院治疗。保险报销后，我每年仍需支付至少9万元的药费，还不包括护理费用，肖说。可能唯一的出路就是卖掉房子来支付父母和孩子的费用。但当我和丈夫变老时，我们的孩子可能也会重复我们现在经历的困境。这个想法让我心碎。独立人口学家黄文正认为，独生子女一代现在面临的困境可能会滚雪球般扩大，其他年龄组看到他们的困境，将竭力避开相同的命运。黄说，政府必须意识到未来的经济问题源于人口过度缩减。从来没有一个像中国这样的国家，每年的新生人口在7-8年内减少了一半。这一问题的根源可以追溯到一胎政策。不同群体的不同命运。有一群退休人员似乎避开了这种命运，那些曾在中国庞大官僚机构工作的人。这些从城市国有体系中退下来的老年人，拥有相对高的养老金和医疗报销水平，这给他们的子女带来了一定的稳定性。在某些情况下，甚至一对独生子女夫妇也可以向父母和祖父母寻求重大购买的资助，这种现象被称为拥有6个钱包。但从中期来看，整体形势依然不明朗。国际货币基金组织预计，到2029年，中国的国内生产总值增长将降至约 3.3%， 相比去年的 5.2% 有显著下降。黄总结道，如果没有有效的激励措施，无法解决这一群体的困境，并改变社会对人口持续缩减的悲观预期，企业不会有信心投资，年轻人也不会有稳定工作的机会和收入。否则，未来年轻人的社会和经济压力只会更大。欢迎大家进入6度探索的辩论环节。我们从正反2个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
毫无疑问，中国的独生子女政策从长远来看，不仅成功地控制了人口爆炸，还为经济发展创造了更好的条件。这一政策使得中国得以摆脱贫困，走向现代化。现在我们可以看到，许多家庭过上了物质富足的生活，这都是当年政策的功劳。如果没有这一政策，中国可能会陷入像印度一样的人口压力、资源紧张的困境。
真是搞笑。独生子女政策确实控制了人口，但是却留下了无数家庭的痛苦。 现在的嘉兴一代正面临着无比沉重的负担，他们既要抚养孩子，又要照顾年迈的父母，这不仅让他们的生活质量下降，也让整个社会的幸福感降低。你说现代化好，但这代价未免太高了吧？
琪琪，你这么说就有点偏颇了。历史上，许多国家在快速发展时都采取了控制人口的政策，比如新加坡。中国的独生子女政策的实施，让我们避免了资源枯竭、环境恶化等一系列问题。你看，70年代的中国贫困率超过30%，而现在这一数字降到了不到1%。这些变化难道不是政策得当的证明吗？
天叔，你可真会选择性记忆啊！是的，政策确实在短期内缓解了资源压力，但长期来看，这政策带来了人口老龄化、劳动力短缺等一系列问题。现在孩子们找工作难，结婚难，生孩子更难。就像那句经典台词，这是怎么造的孽啊？你说这样的生活，谁会觉得幸福？
说到老龄化问题，我得说这是全球性的现象，不仅仅是中国独有。看看日本，他们的老龄化问题比我们严重得多。况且，中国政府已经开始采取措施，比如放宽2胎、3胎政策，提高老年人的社会保障等。这些措施会逐步缓解现有的问题。所谓站在巨人的肩膀上，我们现在的年轻人其实更有机会追求自己的梦想。
天叔，你说的措施确实存在，但问题是他们远远不够。放宽2胎、3胎政策后，有多少人真的敢生？高昂的教育和养育成本让人望而却步。再说社会保障，看看那些低得可怜的养老金，老百姓怎么能安心养老？这些措施只是治标不治本，根本没有解决问题的核心。让我来告诉你，中国的政策需要全面改革，而不是头痛医头，脚痛医脚。
谢谢大家收看六度探索。这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。
大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。本视频录制时间为美东时间10月2日。这一期热点深度，我们要深度剖析在国庆75周年招待会上出现的一些引人注目的角色，重点是那些之前未被提及的人物。习近平主席的出席无疑是最大的焦点。然而，9位露面的前总理温家宝和前全国政协主席李瑞环的现身，却也引发了不小的话题。当然，还有意想不到的人物出现在镜头前。特别是孟建柱的白发与精神状态形成鲜明对比，让人不禁想起政治内部的权力动向，尤其是孟建柱与周永康的对比。孟建柱的白发在当前官场中似乎成了失去一切的象征，而大 V 司马南则在社交媒体上热衷于蹭热度，甚至把自己与明星伊能静的联系搞得沸沸扬扬。整场招待会不仅是名流的聚集，更是政治势力与舆论的交锋。司马南试图借此流量潮水，却不料被拿来与莫言对比，显示出他在文坛上的尴尬地位。这些人物的互动，无不反映着当前中国政治的复杂性与多面性。请大家继续收看详细内容。国庆招待会上新旧正国级人物的现身，不仅引发了诸多话题，也反映出一些更深层次的政治和社会现象。9月30日晚，庆祝中华人民共和国成立75周年的招待会在人民大会堂隆重举行。此次招待会吸引了许多国家和党内的领导人，其中包括现任和退休的高层领导。习近平总书记、国家主席、中央军委主席习近平在会上发表了重要讲话。令人瞩目的是，许多久未露面的退休领导人也出席了活动。其中最引人关注的是前总理温家宝和前全国政协主席李瑞环的现身。82岁的温家宝和90岁的李瑞环分别坐在习近平两旁。温家宝尽管满头白发，但显得精神奕奕，笑容满面。这两位老领导的出现被广泛解读为一种象征性的政治姿态，显示了对老领导人的尊重和团结的象征。 除此之外，还有一些曾经在国庆75周年音乐会上没有出现的前政治局常委们也出席了这次招待会，他们包括李瑞环、温家宝、吴官正和李兰清等。这些前政治局常委的现身，尤其是他们与习近平同桌而坐，进一步凸显了党和国家对他们的认可和尊重。在这些高层领导人中，孟建柱的出现尤为引人注目。孟建柱一头白发，对比其乌黑的脸色，显得格外特殊。在中国的官场文化中，官员们通常会染发以掩盖自己的年龄和健康状况，但近年来，习近平和其他领导人选择以自然的银灰头发示人，意味着一种更加开放和自然的社会风气。然而，孟建柱的白发不仅引发了人们的关注，也让人们联想到前国家安全负责人周永康在法庭宣判前的一头白发。孟建柱的现身引发了诸多讨论，尤其是关于他的政治命运和党内地位的猜测。2017年，孟建柱在中共19大上宣布退休，但此后他提拔的多位干部如孙立军、邓辉林等均被查，这使得孟建柱的处境备受关注。随着这些案件的深入调查，孟建柱也成为了热点话题。在此次招待会上，还有一个颇具争议的人物出现在镜头中，那就是司马南。在央视的新闻视频中，一个镜头捕捉到了疑似司马南坐在伊能静旁边的画面，这引发了广泛讨论。司马南随后在社交媒体上对此做出了回应，以一种自嘲的方式回应了这些猜测。司马南作为一个流量表演艺术家，善于通过各种方式吸引公众注意力。然而，这次他并没有明确表示自己是否真的参加了国庆招待会。有人指出，其实伊能静旁边看起来像司马南的，正是天津音乐学院院长王宏伟。司马南的行为背后反映出一种典型的表演型人格，他善于通过与知名人物和事件关联来获取流量和关注。这种行为模式在近年来的网络环境中并不少见。然而，与司马南不同的是，作家莫言则真正受邀参加了这次国庆招待会。莫言作为中国首位获得诺贝尔文学奖的作家，其地位和影响力得到了国家的认可。而司马南则在莫言获得诺奖后多次公开批评他，认为莫言迎合西方，丑化祖国。但讽刺的是，司马南自己也曾在外国的文化活动中表现积极，这种双重标准令人质疑他的真实动机。在对比司马南和莫言的待遇时，我们可以看到党和国家对知识分子的态度和认可并没有因一时的舆论风波而改变。莫言的受邀表明了国家对他的文学成就和国际影响力的肯定，而司马南则未能获得同样的认可，这也从侧面反映了政治性方向盘极致左打的人的处境。通过这次国庆招待会，我们不仅看到了党和国家对老领导人和知识分子的尊重，也看到了当前中国社会的开放和包容。不同的人物以不同的方式出现在公众视野中，他们的行为和姿态反映出了更深层次的社会和政治变化。整体而言，这次国庆招待会不仅是一场庆祝活动，更是一次国家和党内高层人士的集体亮相和政治姿态的展示。温家宝和李瑞环的出现，无疑是对老一辈领导人的致敬，体现出党和国家对他们的尊重和认可。而孟建柱的出现以及他背后的复杂政治背景，也展示了当前中国政治生态中的一些微妙之处。至于司马南和莫言的对比，则更是揭示了在当前的社会环境中，所谓的流量表演艺术家与真正的文化大家之间的差距。从不同角度来看，这次招待会不仅是一场高规格的庆祝活动，更是一次政治和社会风向的集中展示。老领导人的现身强调了政治传承和团结的重要性，孟建柱的现身则让人们看到了政治斗争和权力交替中的复杂性，而司马南和莫言的故事则揭示了在信息化时代，名人与普通人在公共话语中的地位和影响力的差异。通过这些人物的现身和背后的故事，我们可以更加全面地理解当前中国的政治和社会变化。这不仅是一场表面的庆祝活动，更是一场深层次的政治舞台剧，每一个细节都值得我们细细品味和深入思考。
好了，以上就是今天热点深度所有内容，更多资讯可以关注六度简报网站，网址是6dobrief.com，在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个视频再见。
Title 1: A Strategic Framework for the 21st Century. America needs a new strategy for the international order that is emerging. China has become a formidable strategic competitor. Often this new era is framed as a new Cold War, but it would be a huge mistake to label it as such. To understand why the analogy is wrong, we need to first review the factors that informed the Cold War era. The world in 1946 to 1950. Prior to World War II, America never sought global leadership or responsibility. In the 1800s, America was consumed by managing its internal energies and tensions. Slavery, left unresolved by the formation of the United States, led to a tragic and consuming civil war. The government was absorbed by securing its borders and territories, keeping the British government and the Royal Navy at arm's length, and establishing the foundations for astounding economic growth, fueled by technology-driven expansion in productivity and exploitation of the vast resources of the country. At the end of the 19th century, American leaders sought a larger international role, but exclusively on their own terms. The United States avoided the geopolitics of Europe and cherry-picked its larger involvement in the world. World War II changed everything. Where America could retreat from the larger international order after previous wars, it could not do so at the end of World War II. The country initially faced two overwhelming problems. First, Europe was shattered by two wars separated by a massive recession. World War I proved enervating to the leadership sentiments of European government leaders. World War II broke their economies and displaced tens of millions of people. Allied armies met in Germany after crushing the Wehrmacht. Initially, the United States hoped to rapidly demobilize and convert its war economy toward renewed domestic rebuilding. But the Soviet Union sought to retain a massive military establishment and expropriate resources from what was left of Europe to help rebuild the Russian economy. Europe was prostrated, and the Soviet Union was prepared to use military power to install compliant governments as far as it could. The starkly different political systems, the authoritarian model of the Soviet Union and the liberal, open economic model of the United States, were now directly in conflict. American leaders realized that it was in the country's core national interest to help rebuild Europe consistent with American political and economic values. This required neutralizing the threat of the Red Army that continued to occupy Eastern European territories captured from Nazi Germany while helping to rebuild Western European economies with liberal political ideals and free market economic principles. America needed to retain a large standing military in peacetime, breaking with a tradition that went back to its founding. The country also needed to take the lead in rebuilding the economic foundations of a new international order, built on American values of an open market economy and rule of law. The second problem that confronted America's leaders was in part a derivative of the collapse of Europe. The old colonial European empires were losing vitality, accelerated by the enervating impact of World War I. World War II shattered what little remained of the old European-centric colonial system. Within only a few years, dozens and dozens of former colonies now emerged as new states. But which alternative economic system would prevail, the U.S.-led system built on liberal government, free market principles, and the rule of law, or the Soviet Union system of command mobilization and authoritarianism? To deal with both problems, but especially the second, the United States took the lead to create a system of international organizations that would manage problems that extended past the sovereign remit of any individual country. The priority was economic reconstruction, and what became the so-called Bretton Woods system. Working with wartime allies, the United States pushed to create the United Nations. Everyone had lived through the profound failure of the League of Nations experiment. The authors of the United Nations conceived of a more balanced system that recognized the realpolitik interests of the great powers but also provided a normative structure for the aspirations and interests of newly emerging countries. As the Cold War era advanced, there was further elaboration on the structure that U.S. government leaders created in the early days after World War II. The United States expanded the Bretton Woods institutions beyond the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The UN system became more sophisticated and diverse. The United States augmented its defense agenda with NATO and bilateral defense and security treaties and agreements. The foundation was set. The United States would be an active leader in the world, with its military ensuring security while its diplomacy and commercial activity would help build an international system of institutions designed to promote broad prosperity. The grand strategy that emerged in the competition with the Soviet Union was a big success. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1989 to 1991, unable to sustain its economic model, afford such a massive security establishment, both domestic and military, and keep subordinate allies in line. It all collapsed, thankfully without widespread violence. As discussed below, the end of the Soviet Union was not the end of history, instead leading to the happy emergence of a benign international order built around Western liberal economic and political values. This is not your grandfather's Cold War. Superficially, there are broad strokes of comparability between the Cold War and the current era. The current geopolitical competition with China, and secondarily with Russia, is fundamentally a standoff between two competing political philosophies about how best to structure and lead countries. The United States, Europe, and many important ally and partner countries, including in Asia, share a political philosophy in which the role of government is to ensure a fair and level playing field for the private sector. The government works to balance the interests and demands of individual liberty with the collective requirements of an orderly society. This Western model is based on concepts such as the rule of law, open, but regulated, markets, due process in judicial, political, and administrative procedures, transparent governmental decision-making, an open and free press, and open and free elections. China embraced an authoritarian command mobilization model. The government's legitimacy derives not from a mandate from citizens but from the transcending authority of a sole dominant political party. The Chinese Communist Party decides what is best for individual citizens and for society. China has adapted some structures from the Western model, but there is no question where power lies, or with whom the coercive powers of the state reside. The great competition with the Soviet Union was primarily a military and a diplomatic competition. The Soviet Union was never an economic competitor. By contrast, China is an economic powerhouse, with 4 times as many potential consumers as the United States. It sets the political terms of access to Western companies that want to compete in the Chinese market. Neighboring Asian countries cannot resist the enormous economic pull of the vast Chinese market. The government provides enormous subsidies to start-up companies and to education and research establishments. China has created an impressive array of university laboratories and centers that are engaged in cutting-edge research. The government collects intelligence on other countries and companies, stealing intellectual property. China has also been effective in its diplomatic outreach to countries in Africa, the Middle East, and South America, championing the interests of poor countries against the interests of rich Northern Hemisphere countries, tapping into the lingering resentment over colonialism and the general disregard by American leaders for the issues of the global South. In short, China is a full-dimension competitor, unlike the Soviet Union. China offers a development model that is far more compelling than was that offered by the Soviet Union, and it has mass and momentum in its diplomacy. But there are other factors that make this era starkly different from the Cold War. First, while the United States remains the largest economy in the world, it is not the towering, dominant actor on the global stage. Whereas America's economy was roughly 50% of world GDP in 1946, it is only slightly more than 15% today, after adjusting for purchasing power. In 1950, human talent was highly concentrated in American universities and research facilities. Today, human talent is global and connected in unprecedented ways through modern communication systems. The United States continues to dominate global financial markets, but many new tools are available to individuals, corporations, and countries to work around U.S. financial dominance. The United States is an innovation powerhouse, but so too are Europe, Japan, South Korea, China, Israel, and, increasingly, many other pockets around the world. America remains strong, but not omnipotent. Second, despite its strengths, America's political system is now fractured, disputatious, and dispiriting. Both dominant political parties have adopted the same strategy to win elections, mobilize their angry base voters and exploit real or invented flaws in the opponent to sway unaffiliated voters. Fear and anger are seen as more powerful motivating sentiments to win elections than are specific proposals or broad sentiments of hope and encouragement. This rancorous politics projects grotesque images on the international stage, images exploited by opponents and occasionally by friends. It is hard to see how America can continue to be a welcome leader in the world when it is riven by bitter politics at home. Third, technological advances are moving far faster than the ability of democratic governments to deal with the implications of these technologies. Social media has turbocharged anger and divisiveness in U.S. politics. But there is absolutely no consensus on how the U.S. government should manage the problem. the astounding advancement of artificial intelligence will only amplify this gap between social and commercial developments and government policy. The speed of technological advancements far exceeds the deliberative pace of government. The ultimate product of government is due process, which takes time. The widening gap between advancing technology and government review is now a challenging problem. These technology developments accelerate a broader political pattern seen over the past 60 years where priority is often given to the rights of personal liberty and private benefit over the collective needs of a community. There has also been a sharp rise in alienation in American society, propelled mightily by social media that has no objective standards for truthfulness. Reading or seeing something that validates one's prejudices now constitutes evidence in popular political discourse, making the task of explaining the complexities of problems and the sophistication of policy formulations all the more difficult. Fourth, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted a fundamental issue concerning modern commerce and society. Problems move speedily around the world, but the mechanisms of coordinating effective response are weak and fractured. All of the complex and hard problems in the world today are horizontal, but all sovereign governments are vertical. Really hard problems, pandemics, illegal drugs, refugees and migration, climate change and pollution, illegal money laundering, and terrorism span far beyond the reach of any individual country, no matter how powerful. By contrast, the structures of international collaboration and coordination are weak. Poverty and weak governance in a distant land create fertile conditions for criminality and terrorism. For example, weak regulatory systems in China show up as a flood of precursor chemicals fueling dangerous illegal drug manufacturing in Mexico and the United States. The problems confronting the world today are more complex and multidimensional than was the case in the late 1940s, while the structure of coordination, and even the competency of governments, has remained static at best. Fifth, countries in the so-called Global South no longer see Northern Hemisphere countries as benefactors or agents of positive change. There is a deep and widely held view that Europe and the United States have largely ignored the needs of the Global South. By contrast, China has effectively presented itself as a developing country, sharing the sentiments of aspiring Global South governments and citizens. Developing countries see commercial protectionism enacted by rich countries. Countries in the Global North will gladly take university-educated citizens but block poor migrants. Climate change advocates champion renewable energy sources to low-income countries without recognizing that many of these countries place a higher priority on affordable energy for economic development. International institutions seem structurally biased in favor of the wealthy countries in the Northern Hemisphere. The International Criminal Court seems only to concentrate on wayward African leaders, but never confronting leaders of developed countries. The war in Ukraine has highlighted the ambivalence that countries in the Global South feel about a conflict that they see as unrelated to their needs or aspirations. The world of 2023 is not at all like the world of 1947 and 1948. The strategy that successfully guided the United States through the Cold War will not be adequate for the current day. The United States needs a new national strategy to navigate these complicated waters. What follows is not a strategy. Instead, this report proposes a framework for thinking strategically about the United States' choices and directions. There was no blueprint master plan to survive and succeed during the Cold War. Many of the most important elements of the Cold War strategy emerged only when America confronted an intractable new problem. The strategy for this new era will be similar, but there are outlines of a framework that could guide the United States. Title 2, To Survive as a Nation. It is common for corporations and other organizations to adopt a mission statement. The most apt mission statement for the U.S. government is simple: to survive as a nation and to prosper as a people. The U.S. Constitution used different terms but clearly articulated these goals in the opening sentence by stating that the purpose of the new American government is to provide for the common defense and to promote the general welfare of American citizens. In the early days following World War II, the immediate problem facing U.S. government leaders concerned the security of a shattered Europe. Tensions with the Soviet Union built up during the war but soon became an urgent priority. This led the United States to break with history and to maintain a large standing military establishment, augmented by alliances and partnerships, and to shape the international environment by creating a network of organizations and procedures that would influence the emerging world along lines more favorable to U.S. national interests. Starting with what we inherited. To build a strategy, you need to know your goals. What are national goals? Every modern American president usually adopts a formal national security strategy. But these documents outline the administration's security strategy, not a grand strategy for America's future. Presidents usually articulate elements of a national strategy as part of a political agenda to promote their party's philosophy of governing. The United States does not have a tradition of developing an integrated national strategy that incorporates all of its potential resources, channeled to accomplish specific goals. And a national strategy requires identifying what the country will not do as a nation, which is hard in a polyglot society with a geographically defined representative legislature. More fundamentally, the United States lacks the government structure to develop such a strategy. Congress is divided into dozens of committees and hundreds of subcommittees. There is no way for Congress to develop an integrated national strategy. In theory, a president could create a national strategy, but the cabinet system divides operational jurisdictions into over a dozen stovepipes, hardened by congressional oversight that impedes cross-cutting integration. Within the White House, the president has a National Security Council and a National Economic Council, each competing for the president's time and focus. Important elements of the U.S. economy, such as U.S. universities and research institutions, have only a weak channel into the most senior levels of decision-making in the White House. In short, the country lacks a structural focus for creating a new national strategy. To develop a new national strategy, we return to the fundamental mission statement for the U.S. government from the Constitution: to survive as a nation and to prosper as a people, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The first two great pillars of a national strategy must deal with these primary goals: 1. To survive as a nation, and 2. To prosper as a people. This report will explore them separately, but they are inextricably connected. Security is a prerequisite for prosperity, and prosperity is required to support the structures of government that guarantee security. As stated by a wise observer, we must be safe before we can get rich, and we must get rich to remain safe. Sustain hard defense resources. As discussed above, the United States pursued two primary channels for national security in the early years of the Cold War. The first was to maintain in peacetime a large and sophisticated military establishment and to base elements of that force in countries close to the enemy. These actions were seen as necessary to deter hostile forces acting against U.S. interests. The United States continues to maintain a large and sophisticated military establishment and continues to deploy military units around the world. This long-standing bipartisan consensus is now being challenged. Conservatives are divided. A growing faction argues that the United States should pull back from foreign deployments and focus on domestic security needs, such as securing the southern border of the country. This group of conservatives questions the need for massive defense spending. The other group of conservatives, still a majority, but a declining one, believes that the country has weakened the military through inadequate investment in new kit. These conservatives challenge the Biden administration and have increased the administration's defense budget request every year. Meanwhile, some progressives argue that the United States spends as much on national defense as the next 8 countries combined. Democrats support current operations because they do not want to undercut a Democratic president, but progressives are primed to shift funds from defense budgets to domestic needs when the politics permits. Despite these obviously significant differences in priorities, annual adjustments to defense spending into the defense establishment are relatively minor, reflecting a general consensus among voters. Generally, the American public wants a significant military establishment and accepts the argument that basing forces forward to support allies is beneficial to the United States. While the United States must sustain a strong military, the country must take a serious look at how efficiently it spends money on national defense. The defense budget is enormous, by any measure. In fiscal year 2023, Congress appropriated $853.0 billion for defense spending. We need to put this in context, however. It is critical to exclude the war costs of the past 20 years. However, even including those costs, the $853 billion is not hugely out of scale with spending in the past. FY 1985 saw the peak spending of the so-called Reagan build-up years. When President Reagan came to office, he campaigned on the poor conditions of the U.S. military and weak defense spending in the Carter budget years. President Reagan sought to reverse the decline of spending following the Vietnam War. The height of the Reagan buildup, expressed in FY 2024 dollars, was $718.6 billion. Adjusting this year's $853 billion to FY 2024 inflation brings it to $877.8 billion. So the spending appropriated by Congress in FY 2023 was 22% greater in real terms than the height of the Reagan buildup in 1984. But it is instructive to compare what the United States bought with these two budgets. In 1984, the United States had nearly 300,000 military personnel stationed in Europe. Today, that number is just 66,326. The United States stationed 41,718 Army and Air Force personnel in South Korea in 1985. Today, that number has shrunk to approximately 25,372. In the intervening 40 years, the United States has had 5 rounds of base closures and has closed over 300 military facilities. In short, with a budget that is 22% larger today, the country has a significantly smaller military force than at the height of the Cold War. It is therefore critical to understand how the country is spending more and getting less every year. First, there have been new mission requirements. There was no cyber command back in 1984, space-based resources were more limited, and the U.S. intelligence community has grown significantly, particularly since September 11, 2001, with much of the budget embedded in Department of Defense, DoD, accounts. But the primary reason why the United States is spending more and getting less is there has been far too little fundamental modernization of the DoD organization. For example, Congress passed the hugely important Goldwater-Nichols reform legislation in 1986, which fundamentally transformed and improved the warfighting capabilities of the DoD. At that time, Congress presumed that wars would be fought through the regional combatant commands European Command, Central Command, Pacific Command, and Southern Command. But the United States does not fight wars through unified commands. Today the country establishes joint task forces to conduct actual combat operations, yet the formal structure of regional combatant commands and sub-unified commands has remained unchanged. There are 2 headquarters staffs in the Pentagon, the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Staff of the Joint Chiefs. Neither staff fights wars, except against each other in conference rooms. These 2 staffs largely parallel each other, with little value added for the redundancy. And both have grown hugely over 40 years. 50 years ago, American business removed the institutional barriers between warehouse and transportation functions. Now the private sector seamlessly manages goods, whether they are located on a truck in transit, in a warehouse in stockpiles, in vendor inventories, or on supermarket shelves. The DoD has made only tiny progress in adopting streamlined operations for material support. The last real reform occurred over 30 years ago when some administrative functions, such as finance and accounting, were removed from the military departments and placed in expanded defense agencies. Still, ancient business practices persist with astounding inefficiencies. Congress has periodically legislated reforms on the DoD, but the result has been a larger, more cumbersome bureaucracy. The number of Senate-confirmed positions has grown from 47, excluding the trustees of the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, to 66 over the past 38 years. Procurement costs have also soared, while the quantities of kit being delivered have shrunk. Enormous sums are required for overhead functions. The result is that the country has accommodated soaring costs by shrinking the size of its military forces and buying less modern equipment for operating units. There is no question that the United States needs to retain a strong and capable military force. But the current trend is not a viable path. It needs serious reform and faces hard choices. Congress also needs to scale back the astounding micromanagement it imposes on the DoD. The National Defense Authorization Act in 1985 was 169 pages. In FY 2023, the Annual Authorization Act was over 1,770 pages. There has been an explosion in the size of the Senate and House Armed Services Committees. In 1985, there were 18 senators on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Today there are 25. The House Armed Services Committee grew from 44 to 59 over the same period. More members inherently mean more congressional staff, resulting in ever greater micromanagement of the DoD. And of greater impact, Congress blocks needed efficiencies proposed by the DoD. Congress refuses to close surplus and unneeded facilities, to rationalize its extended laboratory system, or to shut down or streamline depots and arsenals. Congress will often stipulate that a military department must continue to operate an obsolete weapons system in order to preserve activity at bases in members' congressional districts. The DoD is certainly responsible for inefficient use of resources, but Congress equally shares blame for massive waste of resources through micromanagement. Shaping the international environment to favor national goals. The second element of the Cold War strategy is still relevant, but there is less consensus on its content. In the early days of the Cold War era, the United States sought to create a network of institutions that would establish global norms of behavior and expectations. These global norms were fundamentally favorable to American interests and included principles such as the rule of law, stable and convertible currencies, the relaxation of barriers to commerce and investment, due process in judicial and administrative proceedings, the prioritization of peaceful dispute resolution and diplomacy, and a normative bias toward representative government and the rights of citizens. It is important to pause at this point and reflect more directly on the purpose of creating international institutions and norms. The French philosopher Henri Bergson is credited for once saying man invents ideas, but institutions sustain them. The purpose of creating institutions is to establish the sustaining framework that embodies the policy goals and norms desired to be implemented by a government, and to teach those norms to rising generations through the work of those institutions. The United States took the lead to create institutions such as the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and United Nations, as well as the UN agencies, regional development banks, security alliances, and bilateral treaties. This was all done for the same purpose, to shape the future in ways that would make it easier to achieve American interests. America's leaders believed that the interests of other countries would be served by these institutions as well. But the United States did not create them or support them because of some detached nobility of sentiment. It created them because they would help the United States achieve its national goals. Fortunately, what was excellent for the United States also proved good for the world. This is especially important for a global superpower. Most countries, including other great powers, have numerous interests, some in tension with other interests. But no country has the same span of interests as the United States. It is very hard for a global superpower to provide the focus and intellectual capacity required to manage dozens of challenging developments. Having a network of international institutions shaped generally around U.S. political values is enormously beneficial to the country's national goals. Many of these problems can be managed primarily within an institutional framework that is favorable to American values, but without requiring intense American involvement. By definition, any international treaty and treaty-based institution does constrain sovereign flexibility to varying degrees. Historically, the United States has managed this in several different ways. The first, obviously, is to not agree to join the organization or sign the agreement. The United States has refused to join the International Criminal Court because of concern that third parties would turn the court against the United States for a political agenda. The United States has also refused to sign treaties that would be beneficial to U.S. interests, such as the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Ideological opposition tracing back 40 years continues to stymie ratification of a treaty that becomes more important every year. But abstinence is the default choice in the face of controversy. The second option involves some form of a sovereign immunity clause that allows the signatory parties to uphold core fundamental interests of their nations. But the third and most common way that sovereign states have protected their interests is to design the relevant international institution in such a way that its powers are inherently weak and cannot threaten core national interests. We see this vividly in the UN Security Council. The United States and other World War II powers ensured their flexibility by giving themselves permanent veto rights over any action proposed in the Council. Recent years have brought a new phenomenon. The United States has participated in drafting treaties, only to then decide not to enter into the treaty for domestic political reasons. Presidential administrations state that they will observe the conditions of the treaty, but the Senate opts not to ratify it. While nations craft ways to preserve their sovereign flexibility when they join treaty-based international institutions or enter into treaties, the point remains that we ratify treaties and join international organizations because there is more benefit than risk in the work of the institution. Countries join treaties and treaty-based organizations that constrain independent national flexibility because those rules also constrain the flexibility of other countries, which is perceived to have greater value in the long run than any perceived loss of flexibility. Alliances, partnerships, and international organizations. As discussed earlier, America set out on a course after World War II that it had previously avoided. The United States entered treaty-based alliances, bilateral security agreements, and treaty-based international organizations. The impulse was not based on romantic idealism or philanthropy. America created these structures to shape the international environment, bending issues into predetermined channels where we had support from others to deal with the problem. Below, we will examine each of these dimensions of structured international engagement. The rise of standing international organizations. The modern agenda of creating more effective international institutions accelerated in the years after World War II. America and allied countries anticipated the collapse of the previous European-based international order. The United States invited allied countries before D-Day to participate in a series of conferences to create a new international finance structure. The purpose was to facilitate the reconstruction of war-damaged economies, to establish a durable framework for stable exchange rates for international commerce, and to create a framework for helping the economic development of former colonies that gained independence following the collapse of the old European imperial system. Remembering the trauma of the global recession following World War I and the dreadful political consequences that emerged during that time, the Bretton Woods system envisioned a world of open markets, reduced barriers to trade, and international mechanisms to assist in the resolution of national financial crises. The United States and U.S. allies launched a parallel effort to replace the ineffective League of Nations. On April 25, 1945, before the formal end of the war, but with victory in sight, 50 nations met in San Francisco to start the process of drafting a charter for the United Nations. A core dilemma challenged the drafters of the UN Charter: should the structure of the United Nations be built around the practical power reality of the day, or should it be designed to promote the world we wanted to create? The League of Nations failed because it could not balance the practical power dynamics of the interwar period with the idealism codified in the League's charter. The drafters sought to accomplish both goals. The UN Security Council was organized around the practical power dynamics of the day. The major wartime allies were given permanent veto authority over any matter brought before the Security Council. Idealism informed the creation of the General Assembly, where all countries had equal standing. Individual countries and groups of countries could stimulate a focus on a topic of interest. The structure of the United Nations sought to balance the world as it existed with the world that leaders wanted to create. There have been consistent arguments for reforming the UN Security Council. Most countries naturally resent the permanent veto rights given to the victors of a war concluded nearly 80 years ago. While the United States and China represent leading powers today, the other three permanent members have declined in global power. Still, their positions as permanent members of the Security Council ensure that they will not tolerate a dilution of their status. Any meaningful reform is unlikely in the near term. Presently, the Security Council is significantly frozen because of the war in Ukraine and growing tensions between authoritarian powers such as Russia and China and their Western counterparts such as the United States, United Kingdom, and France. While there is considerable ambivalence within American political circles about the United Nations, there are important functions undertaken by the UN system which Americans need and value. Managing political problems in the absence of a functioning government. While the United States has not used the United Nations in this capacity in recent years, one of the body's valuable functions is to step in to serve as the provisional administrative authority when countries or regions lack a coherent government entity. The deterioration of governance in Haiti is a good example of where this function has been used. Undertaking peacekeeping operations when core U.S. interests are not at stake. Presently, there are 12 UN peacekeeping operations around the world. The United States contributes funding and some administrative support to these operations, but largely they are executed by forces contributed from other countries operating under a UN Security Council mandate. See Table 2. Helping to establish standards for international commercial activity, the United Nations has several agencies that provide a global forum for important activities that require explicit international standards. For example, the World Intellectual Property Organization works to facilitate protection of intellectual property throughout the world and to harmonize national legislation when there is disagreement. The International Civil Aviation Organization coordinates global standards for safety, environmental preservation, security, and operational efficiency for worldwide commercial aviation. Coordinating international response to natural disasters and humanitarian need. The United Nations Children's Fund operates the world's largest healthcare delivery organization, administering over 2 billion vaccinations annually to low-income countries and communities. The World Health Organization took the lead in helping African countries deal with the recent Ebola virus outbreaks. The Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Program deliver critical food to countries enduring famine or war-related food insecurity. While criticized in the United States for its ambivalence during the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Health Organization remained the only authoritative source of advice and support for the vast majority of lower-income countries in the world. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs mobilizes aid for and supports crisis-affected communities. Securing nuclear activity. The International Atomic Energy Agency sets standards for safety and security for civilian facilities around the world and is a fundamental monitoring agency to detect the diversion of commercial nuclear resources for covert development of nuclear weapons. These are examples of activities undertaken by international institutions that are valuable to the United States. Not all UN agencies are uniformly helpful, but they serve an important function that benefits America's security, economy, and society. As a nation, the United States would struggle to sustain the pace and rhythm of modern life and manage a wide range of second-tier problems without the United Nations and its agencies. Stronger U.S. support and stronger oversight for the United Nations. Almost from the outset, the United Nations was beset with great power competition and controversy. But in recent years, America's enthusiasm for the United Nations has waned dramatically. Giving Cuba the chairmanship of the UN Human Rights Council struck most Americans as absurd and offensive. For many years, the United Nations considered resolutions condemning Israel over its treatment of Palestinians. The United States often had to veto these resolutions, which contributed to growing disenchantment with the United Nations in U.S. political circles. This has only become far more intense now with the ongoing war in Gaza. The UN system has become a platform for amplifying the agenda of non-governmental organizations, many with a goal of forcing change on U.S. stances on foreign relations. This has fueled the critique that the United Nations threatens U.S. sovereignty. and there are frequent reports of abusive behavior by UN peacekeeping forces towards civilian populations. All of these problems have contributed to a significant deterioration in support for the United Nations among American political figures. These criticisms are valid, but they do not negate the value of having a functioning organization that can coordinate needed international collaboration when it is directly or indirectly affecting American interests. It is also important to note that the United Nations and the wider UN agency system have considerable legitimacy and moral authority around the world, both to governments and individuals. While the United Nations may not enjoy high standing in the United States, it is highly regarded around the world. The United States' strained relationship with the United Nations wins the country no admiration in these nations and capitals. China has made a major push to become a leader within the UN system. It has sought leadership roles in major UN agencies and contributes thousands of peacekeeping soldiers to UN operations while the United States contributes almost none. Table 3 below shows the top 10 state contributors of personnel to UN peacekeeping operations as of 2022. China is 10th in the world. The United States, with 30 staff officers and 3 experts on mission, ranks 78th. The United Nations has been a major channel through which China has projected its claims to better represent the interests of developing countries. China is on the march within the UN system, while the United States is often observing from the sidelines, occasionally booing the play of the game. The United Nations does offer significant benefits to the United States. But there are legitimate questions about its efficiency and the accountability of UN leaders and agencies. The United States should continue to support the United Nations, but it should also take a larger role in leading UN deliberations. In exchange, the United States needs greater accountability of UN leaders and operations to restore credibility that the United Nations is worthy of U.S. support. The United States should join other like-minded countries to demand a stronger process of performance reviews and assessments of UN activities. The United Nations needs an independent Inspector General function that reports to the Security Council, not just the Secretary General. Adapt and strengthen alliances. Countries join security alliances for varying reasons. It might be to draw more strength to manage a core problem facing the country. It may be to strengthen another country whose security is judged essential to its own national interests. It might be to present a more complex security challenge to an opponent. The reasons vary, but they all share a common attribute. Treaty-based security alliances are designed to provide strategic depth for a country. The United States joined or created military alliances after World War II because the agreements added strategic depth to our sovereign power. There is a second common reason for security alliances. These structures are normative, creating a framework for a shared agenda of security-related political objectives. The framework developed by one generation of leaders carries over to succeeding generations so long as the conditions attendant to the treaty remain in place. This was evident in the way NATO responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Even though Ukraine was not a signatory member of NATO, Europe collectively saw the risk posed to the continent if Russian aggression was not countered. The NATO treaty gave structure and coherence to the deliberations before and following the invasion and led to an aligned response across the spectrum of European politics and priorities. The compelling attributes of NATO led both Finland and Sweden to seek membership. Nearly 75 years after the founding of NATO, national leaders today understand the structure of defense and the values of the alliance because of the normative qualities of standing treaties. And again, for emphasis, the NATO treaty provides strategic depth for all signatories, and especially for the United States. America's primary security priority today focuses on Asia and managing the rise of China as a superpower. NATO makes it possible for America to make decisive contributions in Europe while sustaining its strategic focus in Asia. The war in Ukraine also highlights yet again the relatively weak defense capabilities of European countries. European countries have generously donated combat equipment to Ukraine, but few of the weapons have been accompanied by spare parts or maintenance equipment. Munition stocks are thin. 53 European defense establishments still devote excessive percentages of resources to parochial infrastructure, such as national training establishments, parallel command headquarters, and redundant acquisition establishments. The United States still must provide the integrating structure and impetus for collective action by NATO. Retool NATO. While it is gratifying to see the focus and energy in Europe on defense matters, now is the time to undertake serious retooling of NATO. At the end of the Cold War, NATO shifted its focus to preparing and integrating new member states. The political dimension of NATO grew, and warfighting preparedness declined. When Russia invaded Crimea, there were no operational war planners in NATO headquarters. The regional warfighting headquarters had been disestablished. There were no operational command structures between the NATO operational headquarters and a battalion in the field. Since 2014, America and European partners have undertaken strong efforts to put muscle tone back into NATO. These organizational and operational investments have been crucial in the current effort to support Ukraine. The war in Ukraine now highlights the underlying strategic premise of NATO. It is a collective security alliance designed for unified action against a direct threat to members of the alliance. The only direct threat to NATO comes from a revanchist Russia. Clearly now there are 4 primary theaters of combat facing NATO, reinforcing Finland primarily and the Nordic states secondarily. Securing the Baltic Sea for unfettered NATO operations and commercial navigation. Reinforcing the central frontline states, primarily Poland, the Baltic states, and possibly Ukraine in the future, against a ground invasion. Providing effective air and missile defenses for all of Europe. NATO now needs to realign its operational command structure around these 4 theaters of operation. In addition, NATO needs a serious restructuring of the support mechanisms required for combat operations. This would include a NATO-wide logistics and transportation command, a NATO-wide training organization for advanced combat and combat support training, and a NATO-wide command to manage test and training ranges and facilities. Currently, individual countries largely make solo decisions about procurement priorities and organizational competencies. There is no blueprint for what the European side of NATO needs for capabilities and where it stands in providing those capabilities through the efforts of individual member nations. The European component of NATO needs organizational rationalization as well as a blueprint to guide forward plans and investments by individual countries. While NATO is inherently valuable as an operational collective security structure, it is especially important because America's strategic security focus has shifted to Asia. Back in 2011, President Obama directed a strategic security review in light of the budget agreement with congressional Republicans to cut back on defense spending as part of a broader agreement to constrain federal budgets. At the conclusion of that review, President Obama proposed a pivot to Asia. He was then criticized because while the pivot was welcome, there was no subsequent buildup of forces in Asia. This policy shift was made in the context of plans for major defense budget reductions. President Obama basically committed to preserve U.S. military strength and operational pace in the Pacific while cutting back on military activities in Europe and the Middle East. The salient importance of this pivot was not recognized at the time. It was the first time in American history when the U.S. government said that Asia, not Europe, was the country's highest security priority. This remains true, despite active U.S. support of Ukraine through NATO. The war in Ukraine would have been far more challenging for the United States had the framework of NATO not been in place to share the burden of reinforcing Ukraine. Still, there are things that can and should be done to strengthen NATO further. European defense ministries are still woefully underpowered because so much of their budgetary resources are devoted to purposes such as redundant headquarters, training establishments, and acquisition bureaucracies. Collectively, European NATO partners have spoken for years about rationalization, pooling, and sharing of resources. But very little has been done. The United States' demand for modernizing NATO must go beyond hectoring European countries to spend more money. There needs to be a concrete blueprint for what the European element of NATO can and should become in the future. Rather than just tuck into various areas of American-led forces, Europe needs a coherent integrated defense capability. And that can come only through serious rationalization of defense contributions, consistent with a blueprint that would produce a coherent integrated European defense establishment. This should be the current focus, using the recent experience of Russian aggression as a yardstick for measuring how well European defense forces could manage an invasion like that experienced by Ukraine. U.S. partnerships in Asia, defense in Asia. The Korean War globalized the great security standoff with the Soviet Union. The victory of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, followed by the Korean War, convinced American government leaders at the time that communism was on the march and that Asia needed a collective security structure like NATO. In September 1954, the United States and 7 other countries created the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Tellingly, 5 of the 8 countries, Australia, France, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States, were primarily culturally European. Both the Philippines and Thailand were treaty partners to the United States, and Pakistan joined primarily to seek support in its standoff against India. Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam were given presumed military protection through a protocol instrument but were never formally part of SEATO. SEATO had no organic roots in Southeast Asia, despite its name. It lacked geographical propinquity. The central organizing concept was alignment against the Soviet Union and China, which led as many countries to eschew membership as to join. Pakistan pulled out in 1973, South Vietnam was defeated in 1975, and SEATO formally ended in 1977. At the same time, the United States was developing deeper security structures with Japan and South Korea on a bilateral basis, which met with greater success. The threat posed by China was more immediate, and the United States had opportunities to create a much wider range of contact points with both countries than it did with Southeast Asian countries. The Korean War caused the United States to retain significant conventional combat forces in Japan and South Korea and pushed it to focus on developing the domestic political structures of both countries. The security ties with Japan and South Korea were important, but even more important was the way both countries would develop powerful, vibrant economies that generally embraced U.S.-European geoeconomic norms. America kept significant military forces in both countries as part of the larger security structure designed to manage the rise of China in Asia. Initially, the United States had a containment strategy for China, but that shifted dramatically with President Nixon's outreach to China, which was accelerated by China's decision in 1978 to drop a policy of autarky and instead open its economy to global markets and global investments. The security dimension of the U.S.-Japan and U.S.-South Korea relationship remained relevant, but the transition within China following the economic reforms shifted the focus to economic engagement. America needed both Japan and South Korea as major components of its security architecture. This was complicated by the tensions that remained between them, significantly because of Japan's brutal occupation of the Korean peninsula prior to and through World War II. Most recently, the Biden administration has demonstrated considerable skill in creating a working trilateral relationship. The rise of a more pugnacious China, the continued bellicosity of North Korea, and the election of pragmatic politicians as prime minister and president respectively in Japan and South Korea with prominent security agendas have led to landmark structures of closer collaboration. Quadrilateral security dialogue. Nonetheless, Asia remains a theater where security arrangements represent networks of relationships, but with no overarching security structure like NATO. The most important recent development is the establishment of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, most commonly called the Quad. The Quad comprises 4 countries: Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. It was initially proposed by Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo back in 2007 in conversation with Australian Prime Minister John Howard, Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney. The idea languished for a decade as political sentiments shifted in Australia, India, and Japan. In 2017, 3 new leaders plus Abe again committed to support the Quad dialogue, stimulated by concerns over Chinese island building in the South China Sea. Started during the Trump presidency, the Quad picked up momentum under President Biden. The Quad is not and will never be a security treaty, despite China's loud complaint that it is a mini-NATO. There is no geographical propinquity to the Quad, and each country has wide-ranging political and economic priorities that are at times in tension with each other. The unifying feature of the Quad, however, is a concern about a rising, more pugnacious China and the need for coordination to counter Chinese political and military intimidation in the region. The Quad will also likely never grow into a larger group. The unstated but obvious purpose of the Quad is to counter China. No other country in the region wants to join the Quad, knowing it will unleash intense pressure from China. There is no need for more members. Each of the 4 members of the Quad brings its own networks of diplomacy, commercial ties, and mutual support agreements with other countries in the region. The Quad is primarily a network of networks providing reassurance and stability in the region. The Great Void, the lack of an American trade policy. While much of the security framework architecture for Asia is in place, there is a gaping void with the absence of a real American trade policy for the region. For most countries in Asia, foreign policy is trade policy. The value of a comprehensive trade policy for Asia is that it becomes the backbone of a rules-based international system of mutual interest and support. In 2006, 4 small economies in the Pacific region developed an economic framework that expanded to become the most ambitious trade agreement in recent times. In 2009, the United States joined this process and sought to use its leverage to create higher standards and a broader structure for the agreement. What emerged was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which President Obama formally endorsed in the spring of 2016. Opposition in Congress, Republicans did not want to give President Obama a victory, and Democrats were cowed by opposition from labor unions and environmentalists, prevented ratification during the Obama administration. President Trump subsequently withdrew from the treaty on January 23, 2021. After the United States withdrew from the TPP, the agreement was not ratifiable under its existing terms. The late Prime Minister Abe saw an opportunity for Japan to play a larger leadership role in Asia. Japan took the lead, using the bulk of the TPP agreement as the basis for a streamlined version relabeled as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. For Abe, even without U.S. participation, the CPTPP was important for setting rules for trade that were not based on a Sino-centric view. Presidents Trump and Biden have since ignored it, and the United States remains outside of it. Responding to criticism that it lacked a trade policy, the Biden administration has proposed something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. The title reveals its true nature. EPF is just a framework, outlining the conditions that the United States will insist upon in discussing trade matters with other Asian countries. Asian partners and allies have met IPEF with a polite yawn. Asian countries believe IPEF offers few tangible benefits. They are willing to engage the United States through IPEF, believing that this is as much as the United States can muster these days. And while there are small steps forward within the IPEF framework, for all practical purposes the United States has no real trade policy for Asia. This is a theater where trade policy is the foundation for foreign policy. The sad irony is that the Biden administration often champions an international rules-based order as its strategic objective. That was what the TPP was, and now the CPTPP is. But it is not something the Biden administration will now champion or support. Title III, To Prosper as a People. The second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence states clearly the purpose of the U.S. government, specifically enshrining the goals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness sounds a bit superficial, but fundamentally it means the government should enhance the well-being and prosperity of its citizens. This forms the second great element of our national strategy framework. The United States has not done badly over the past 50 years. In 1970, The income per capita was a little less than $26,000, expressed in constant 2015 dollars. By 2021, this figure exceeded $60,000, far higher than the world average of around $11,000. Compared to other countries, the United States started with a remarkable set of advantages: a large landmass with very productive agricultural resources, abundant mineral and energy resources, long coastlines on 2 oceans with good harbors, relatively temperate climatic conditions, and a tradition of welcoming immigrants from around the world. Many of America's strengths are also grounded in decisions made and sustained by governments and institutions over time. The United States remains a world leader in university-level education, with top-notch businesses, strong government and non-governmental institutions, and a dynamic civil society. And the United States retains the most capable military in the world. Each of these attributes of power has contributed to and derived benefits from growing prosperity in the United States. A growing and diverse population. By 2053, the United States is projected to reach a population of more than 370 million, up from 336 million in 2023. About 75% of that growth, or about 25.5 million people, is projected to come from net immigration. The U.S. Census Bureau projects that the fastest-growing racial or ethnic group of the next 40 years will be people who are 2 or more races, suggesting that tomorrow's Americans will more accurately represent the long-held concept of America as a melting pot. Perhaps as important, tomorrow's Americans may be better positioned to move within and among global cultures, leveraging America's diversity as a strength in both diplomacy and business. A world-leading innovation ecosystem. The United States remains a world leader with its innovation ecosystem. Arguably, much of that strength starts with the United States university system. Global rankings indicate that 39 of the world's top 100 universities are in the United States, including 17 public universities. The strength of America's educational institutions translates into a high level of education among Americans. About half of Americans aged 25 to 64 have post-secondary degrees, up from 42% in 2010. The education Americans receive enables them to tackle more complicated and sophisticated challenges. Within the United States, approximately $656 billion goes toward research and development every year. Of that, the government share is 22%. Finally, the strength of the U.S. innovation ecosystem is globally recognized. The United States is the top destination for foreign patent filers. More non-residents file for patents in the United States than residents. A top-notch business environment. The United States remains the strongest consumer and capital market in the world. It provides a high-standards, relatively low-cost business environment for firms. 59 of the world's 100 largest firms are in America, with the United States holding 65% of total market value, equal to more than $20 trillion. This is more than 4 times the number of leading companies based in China and 4 times their market capitalization. There are over 33 million small businesses in the United States, which employ more than 61 million people. Approximately 3.2 million businesses are immigrant-owned, employing more than 8 million people. A vibrant and thriving civil society. The United States retains a vibrant and dynamic civil society spanning nonprofits, social support organizations, and religious institutions. There are more than 1.6 million registered charities in the United States. Donations to those charities consistently account for approximately 2% of GDP and support approximately 10% of the U.S. labor force. Individual contributions provided 64% of the support to charities in 2022. This broad spectrum of organizations enables U.S. society to adapt and adjust relatively quickly to shocks, including natural disasters and sudden migration flows, or to better understand the impact of changing laws and policies. Few other countries have such a strong network of civil society organizations. Overall, these advantages have helped America become an economic powerhouse. Today, it constitutes 25% of global GDP, not adjusted for purchasing power parity, despite accounting for only 4% of the world's population. Economic progress is very uneven in America today. Aggregate data suggests that America has done very well over the past 7 decades. But aggregate data such as income per capita masks a far more complex reality, as shown below with data as of October 2023. The top 10% of households by wealth held 69% of total household wealth. The bottom 50% of households collectively held only 2.54% of total household wealth. Black and Hispanic families owned only a quarter of the wealth of white families on average. Families headed by someone with only a high school education had only 22% of the wealth of families headed by a graduate from a 4-year college or university. Families headed by someone with less than a high school diploma had only 10% of the wealth of families headed by a college graduate. A portion of Americans are born with advantages well beyond the reach of the majority of citizens. The gap between upper-class and lower-class cadres is widening. People who work with their hands find the wind in their faces. People who work with their minds find the wind at their backs. Strengthening America's economy starts with addressing the income gap. Over the past 30 years, the gap in annual income between high-income workers and medium and low-income workers has widened significantly. And this has become a major dimension of the United States domestic political debate. As was said pointedly in the days during and after the recession of 2009, blue-collar workers lost their jobs and bankers lost their bonuses. We see a widening gap in incomes between urban centers with high concentrations of mind workers and rural and Rust Belt America where more workers work with their hands. A widening income and wealth gap matters from a macroeconomic perspective. Flat incomes for the bulk of workers limits their capacity to consume. Soaring incomes of well-compensated workers result in savings that need to find a channel for investment. The past 30 years of globalization and the opening of the vast Chinese labor market have created enormous disparities in the United States. Competing against 400 million hungry Chinese workers, blue-collar American workers have struggled. 88 returns to labor have remained flat in real terms. Returns to capital, moving the unconsumed savings of highly compensated individuals, have soared, particularly due to new investment opportunities in Asia. Yes, blue-collar workers have benefited from cheap t-shirts and sneakers manufactured in China, but the widening income gap has also delivered stagnant wages and dying neighborhoods. This has contributed to the great unresolved debate now underway in America about fairness in the economy. It was the foundation of the Biden administration's Build Back Better agenda. In this agenda, progressives defined what they thought it would take to remove the barriers facing blue-collar workers. Conservatives saw it as a massive expansion of government bureaucracies and programs, and a return to redistribution politics. This report does not choose to enter this debate or take sides in it. It does, however, want to use it as a springboard for its first fundamental observation. America is a rich and prosperous nation, but the distribution of income now is limiting future growth. Roughly 70 to 75% of GDP goes to consumption. If wages for the bulk of American workers remain stagnant, future economic growth will be limited. Highly compensated workers end up investing their income in other countries where markets are growing. Of equal concern is the accumulation of massive deficits caused by our desire to spend more on the government than we are prepared to pay through taxes. The federal government now has accumulated deficits exceeding $34 trillion. In addition, we need to add to this figure the over $34 trillion of unfunded commitments for entitlements, such as Social Security, government pensions, Medicare, and Medicaid. A modern and successful society should provide security for its population, but it also must pay these bills. At present, the United States is pushing these liabilities onto the shoulders of Americans' children and grandchildren. Committing to a growth strategy for the American economy. America needs a new political commitment to economic growth. Progressives are more interested these days in economic justice than they are in economic growth. Progressives also believe economic growth threatens the environment. Conservatives, meanwhile, have become preoccupied with woke capitalism. Because the two political parties are so evenly balanced in Congress, the battles are endless and incremental. Strategically important issues fall victim to tactical posturing for temporary advantage in the next election. The Biden administration will argue, with justification, that the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, was designed to stimulate new jobs in the context of boosting renewable energy. The jury is still out on whether these incentives are sufficient to create the irreversible momentum needed to transform the fundamental position currently held by hydrocarbon energy sources. Congress did pass, on a bipartisan basis, the CHIPS and Science Act, which provides financial support to boost manufacturing of semiconductors in the United States. The CHIPS Act also provides authorization for a wide range of much-needed support for U.S. universities, research institutes, and other elements of the ideas industry, but only the semiconductor provisions were funded. Still, the CHIPS Act does indicate that the United States can indeed undertake industrial policy on a bipartisan basis. It is doubtful that the CHIPS Act would have passed without the unifying fear of China as a geopolitical and geoeconomic competitor. But the CHIPS Act was authentically bipartisan. These are welcome examples, but they are exceptions to the current political landscape. Neither political party has a coherent agenda to boost economic growth in America. Without a growing economy, the two political parties will be battling over a shrinking pie. The liberal conception of the role of government. America is confronting a great competition with China. China has a profoundly different concept for the role of government in Chinese society. America's concept traces back centuries, drawing heavily on ideas that emerged in the writings of French and English political philosophers as well as movements such as the Scottish Reformation. The purpose of government is to create the appropriate balance between the rights and liberties of individuals and the needs and responsibilities of society. This is best accomplished through a government structure with checks and balances. The best articulation of this is still found in the Federalist Paper No. 51, authored by James Madison, The Great Security Against a Gradual Concentration of the Several Powers in the Same Department, consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the other. One element of the government can effectively stop the unilateral action of another branch. All must work together for a durable new policy direction. In economic matters, the role of government is to ensure a fair and level playing field for the private sector. This requires multiple actions. The government must create and maintain a stable currency. It requires a system for protecting intellectual property that properly balances individual benefit and societal need. The government must establish a fair and transparent legal system based on due process, as well as a system for standardizing specifications for goods and services so that commerce can occur beyond a small neighborhood. In today's world, this likely means that the government will have to take a greater role in cybersecurity, especially in developing solutions to ensure the authenticity of information. Within this objective and transparent framework, the private sector is free and encouraged to operate based on perceived opportunity. Entrepreneurs will decide what new opportunities can be created. Customers will decide if they want these products or services, and at what price. Technologies advance and open new ideas and channels for entrepreneurs and potentially new products and services for customers. The marketplace decides winners and losers, not the government. Over the years, our political leaders have changed and expanded the definition of what is required to provide a fair and level playing field. Abraham Lincoln felt that America's future was limited without a significant boost in higher education sponsored by the government. To protect investors in financial markets, the government created the Securities and Exchange Commission. To protect consumers from exposure to adulterated food or dangerous products masquerading as drugs, the government created the Food and Drug Administration. To ensure safe air transportation, the government created the Federal Aviation Administration. Government plays a significant and vital role in modern American society by ensuring that the marketplace is fair, stable, and safe for consumers who otherwise could not protect themselves through their own agency. This has not been a conflict-free process. The government has expanded as problems were identified and possible solutions were explored and adopted. And political conflict carries on after the establishment of a new policy. In a representative government, conflicting perspectives must be reconciled through a legislative process where all parties have access to the representatives and senators who will ultimately decide what is needed. But the controversy does not end there. Executive branch regulation is required to implement broad new legal policies, but this rulemaking process is always filled with tension and controversy. The politics that lead to the creation of a new government regulatory mandate invariably requires extensive and contentious rulemaking procedures for implementation. Aggrieved parties may take a judicial route to try to change the approach used to implement the legal mandate. And these issues will change as new economic or technological developments advance and require some adjudication in the regulatory process, and sometimes through judicial action. Despite the controversy that accompanies government regulation, there is an important byproduct that has greatly benefited America. Quality government oversight creates value. Stringent regulation of financial markets and a strong judicial system have fundamentally made America's financial markets attractive for investors worldwide. Stringent regulation of drugs and medical devices has effectively created a value premium for any U.S. product that is approved for sale by the FDA. Stringent air safety standards have made America the aviation leader of the world and ensured that U.S. manufactured aircraft are valued around the world. High-quality regulations create high-value products and services. But the modern administrative structure of the U.S. government has created enormous inefficiencies through elaborate processes and regulations. Regulatory burdens in the United States result in capital resources moving to other countries where it is easier to build factories and hire people. China has come to dominate the processing of critical and rare earth metals because America raised environmental standards while China welcomed investment with little regard for the environment. But once these enormously capital-intensive investments have been made, long-term patterns of commerce are locked in. America's current regulatory environment and culture of litigiousness has become a major factor that will inhibit returning mining and manufacturing to American soil. If America is going to compete more effectively in the future, it needs to streamline the regulatory burden presented to companies and individuals. Industrial policy. The term industrial policy was politicized when then-President Jimmy Carter tried to boost his flagging popularity before re-election by formally launching a national industrial policy initiative. Candidate Ronald Reagan strongly condemned the idea, and from that moment, the term industrial policy has been burdened by politics. Over the past 40 years, industrial policy is routinely condemned, but the argument is superficial. In reality, America has always pursued sensible industrial policies. Abraham Lincoln, as a candidate, had two main pillars in his campaign platform. One called for government investment in infrastructure, and the second called for government spending on university education. He followed through, pushing legislation to create incentives to build the Transcontinental Railroad and encouraging the creation of the so-called land-grant universities that became the backbone of higher education in America. General Dwight D. Eisenhower saw the power of the limited access, high-speed Autobahn road networks in Germany. He recalled his time in the Army in the 1930s, taking 3 months to move across the United States on poorly designed and constructed roads. When he became president, he pushed to create the interstate highway system. Senator Pete Domenici, wanting to help support the Department of Energy's nuclear labs in his state, pushed for funding in nuclear weapons labs for the first mapping of the human genome, a step that has completely revolutionized modern medicine and biological research. The Department of Defense began developing the satellite-based global positioning system in the 1970s. While designed for the precision targeting of weapons systems, the GPS signal was offered to the public for commercial exploitation. GPS is now ubiquitous in American commerce. It not only makes ride-hailing services possible but is also used as a fundamental resource for synchronizing distributed computer systems, enabling activities such as using credit cards to pay for gasoline at self-serve stations. The Trump administration initiated a series of public-private partnerships to boost quantum research and development. The Department of Energy funded the costs of these new quantum research centers. These are just examples of historic steps that America has taken with the explicit goal of creating incentives and structures to promote new economic opportunities and to ultimately enhance prosperity. The CHIPS Act is fully consistent with this rich history of shaping incentives for important new opportunities. These examples share a critical common dimension. American industrial policy generally funds the infrastructure of knowledge that cannot be built through market forces alone. No single company could afford to build a transcontinental railroad back in 1862. But once built, the railroads opened the vast heartland for countless opportunities, such as helping farmers get raw or semi-processed food to distant markets. Research on the genome and a nuclear weapons laboratory created part of the infrastructure that permitted the development of mRNA vaccines to manage the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the obvious need to develop a thoughtful national industrial policy strategy, the U.S. government is poorly suited to create it. Modern commerce and new technologies cut horizontally across the stovepipes of the cabinet departments and across the jurisdictions of congressional committees, which basically map, sometimes a bit incoherently, against the structure of the executive branch departments and agencies. Which cabinet department is responsible for AI? Which cabinet department should take the lead in shaping the realignment of global supply chains? These cutting-edge developments and opportunities do not fit neatly in the existing structures of the federal government. They come together only in the White House, but the White House is also the platform for one political party at any one time. Initiatives springing from the White House inherently carry political baggage. America needs a novel way to develop a national industrial and national security strategy. We need a national strategy for making strategic investments, both in the government and in the private sector. Development of that strategy should be sponsored by the U.S. government, but no members of the U.S. government, other than support staff, should prepare it. A national commission should be appointed for a 3-year period to develop a national strategy. Members of the commission would be nominated, half by the President and half by the Congress. All members would have to be confirmed by the Senate. For administrative support, the Commission should be supported by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The Commission would be responsible for highlighting important new technological and societal developments that will have significant impact on future prosperity and security, as well as highlighting the gaps in American public and private resources regarding expertise on these issues. Strengthen the foundations of innovation in the United States. The United States remains the world's leading innovation power. To remain competitive in the future, the United States cannot simply assume today's advantages will persist without continued investment. There are 3 areas where the United States can act in the near term to drive its competitive position forward: strengthening the U.S. role in standard setting, updating the patent system for the present day, and increasing the United States' ability to attract and retain talent. Strengthening America's role in standard setting. Setting standards to shape American commerce started at the very beginning of our country. To bring together 13 separate colonies into a coherent new government, our first leaders knew that a pound of flour in Virginia needed to weigh the same as a pound of flour in New York. Standard setting seems a simple and uninteresting topic. However, operating on common standards is what allows companies to sell products widely and to innovate quickly. Explicit standards ensure that consumers reap the benefits of new ideas without being locked into one company's products. With explicit standards, products can improve in an open competitive market. An example of critical standards that have helped transform the world comes from those that govern wireless communication protocols. No matter where you are or what device you own, connecting to Wi-Fi works the same. This standard did not happen randomly. It was developed through engagements between competing firms, policymakers, and academics working to develop a standard that maximized consumer benefit, streamlined production requirements, and met necessary safety standards for communications devices. An example of a cutting-edge issue that would benefit from concerns for global standards is the energy transition. Currently, there are inadequate standards for measuring, reporting, and verifying greenhouse gases embedded in manufactured goods. The Department of Energy is already working on this front, and economical counting of carbon could become strategic high ground in a border-adjusted world. Today's global standards are the product of decades of American leadership and the astounding technological advancement of the past 50 years. China has seen the power of global standards and now seeks to gain leadership positions in global standards-setting organizations. Sujai Shivakumar, Director of Renewing American Innovation at SAIS, notes, China's determination to dominate standards extends to controlling communications and discourse. Linking Internet governance and standards, Chinese President Xi Jinping has stated that in cybersecurity and telecommunications, the game of great powers is not only a game of technology but also a game of ideas and discourse power. Developing standards for the digital economy therefore also requires reference to standards for political expression. When new technology opens up new concepts for products or services, there is generally no accepted standard to guide commercial exploitation. For example, there is currently no set of standards for AI. Many governments, including China, India, the European Union, and the United States, are all embarking on efforts to begin regulating this new area of technology, though doing so before any standards are set can also create a balkanized world where standards become different in different markets, reducing efficiency and slowing innovation. America has a unique approach to standards setting. In the United States, the private sector sets the standards. The role of government is to recognize and enforce them and ensure that the standards are developed broadly within an industry. In China, setting standards is an explicit act of government control. In Europe, the European Union plays a very large role in shaping standards. Because America's approach leaves it to the private sector, we face a challenging future if China comes to dominate standards-setting venues. To succeed in the emerging standards-setting competition, the United States will need bipartisan and consistent focus on resourcing standards-setting organizations and ensuring that the United States nominates strong and experienced leaders to these institutions, specifically including individuals capable of setting clear, achievable agendas and developing the necessary coalitions to succeed in setting standards that embody U.S. values. Updating the patent system for the present day. The United States has always been a nation of inventors. An important aspect of U.S. competitiveness over the past 100 years has been the strength of the U.S. patent system. The patent system has sought to balance the interests of the inventor and the interests of consumers by allowing inventors to derive the sole benefit of their innovations for a set period of time. This system has propelled forward an ever-accelerating wave of creativity. The United States' innovative spirit rests on a complex network of economic rules favoring market-based competition, predictable legal arrangements for patenting and securing intellectual property, and incentives for investors. For decades, the United States set the global pace on patents. Over the past 20 years, global innovators, especially in China, have closed the gap and, in some cases, exceeded U.S. patent output. Despite the successful track record of the U.S. patent system, there are growing calls within the United States to fundamentally reform the patent system. In many cases, the proposals include decreasing or eliminating the duration of patent benefits, arguing that the duration of the exclusive use period of the current patent system stifles innovation by limiting access to new technology. If these so-called reforms reduce or eliminate the exclusive use window of a patent, the financial incentive to make the necessary investments to develop new technologies is effectively eliminated. The benefits of innovating will be eclipsed by the ability to rapidly copy emerging technology. Only China would benefit from such an approach. At the intersection of standards and patents are standard essential patents, patents that form the basis of industry standards and allow both consumers and a broader array of firms to participate in innovation. Common in a range of technologies, including telecommunications, wireless systems, the Internet of Things, and AI, SEPs are offered at terms determined to be fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. SEPs allow a company to develop and profit from a technology that becomes an industry standard without leveraging that position to eliminate its competition. increasing the ability to attract and retain global talent. As stated in the final report of the Size Trade Commission on affirming American leadership, the United States thrives when it invites the best and brightest from around the world to set up shop and contribute to the U.S. economy. Yet immigration policy now is one of the most contentious issues facing the U.S. government, with very little consensus on how to proceed. The analysis below draws heavily on work undertaken by Remco Swetsloot while he was a trustee fellow at Size, William Reinsch, Scholl Chair in International Business at Size, and his colleague Jack Caporal. The role of immigrants in the U.S. economy is often overlooked as a driver of both innovation and growth. As of 2021, there were 3.4 million immigrant entrepreneurs in the United States. As of 2017, immigrant-owned businesses employed 8 million people. Those businesses had cumulative sales of more than $1.3 trillion. In innovation, immigrants to the United States also contribute at levels above their share of the population. According to a 2022 paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research, from 1990 to 2016, immigrants accounted for approximately 10% of the U.S. population but created approximately 16% of inventions, 23% of patents, and 24% of top patents. Altogether, they contributed more than 25% of market value of the firms benefiting from the patents. Every year, the United States sets aside 416,000 green cards for permanent immigrants. This allows non-citizens to live and work in the United States on an unlimited basis. Total green cards are subdivided into three groups: 226,000 for family preference green cards, 140,000 for employment-based green cards, reserved for skilled workers as well as investors, and 50,000 diversity green cards for individuals from countries with low rates of immigration to the United States. Not only are there numerical caps imposed on green cards every year, but there are country limits that preclude more than 7% of green cards every year going to one country. This has a major impact on green card applicants from countries such as India, China, the Philippines, and Mexico. The United States is no longer recruiting foreign talent at the same pace as in earlier eras. From 2000 to 2016, foreign enrollment in U.S. universities doubled from 500,000 to over 1 million students. Growth slowed, beginning in 2016 to 17, and turned negative by 2019 to 20. The COVID-19 pandemic saw foreign enrollment drop by 15%, with only a modest rebound in 2021 to 22. In 2022, 54% of international students majored in science, technology, engineering, and medicine programs. A large portion of foreign STEM students historically came from China, but the current tensions with China have had a dampening impact on Chinese students applying for admission to American universities. In addition to declining numbers of international students enrolling at U.S. universities, it is difficult for firms to hire foreign nationals, even if these individuals are highly qualified. The CSIS Trade Commission notes that the H-1B visa is capped at 85,000 visas annually, despite consistently hitting the limit months before the deadline for companies to apply. Further, visas are distributed by lottery, discourage, ING, companies from hiring international students and foreign workers. The number of H-1B visas available has been steady since 2004. From 1999 to 2003, however, H-1B visa quotas were set at between 115,000 and 195,000 per year based on two laws passed in 1998 and 2000, respectively, the American Competitiveness and Workforce Improvement Act and the American Competitiveness in the 21st Century Act. If the United States has an enduring asymmetric advantage over nearly every country, it is immigration. For centuries, the United States has drawn talented and ambitious people from all over the world. We see this today in U.S. universities and across the cutting-edge American economy. Innovation relies on access to the most talented people. For much of the 20th century, the United States leveraged deep investment in domestic education and a pipeline of foreign talent to drive American innovation to new heights. As one Size expert put it, the U.S. government risks squandering that advantage through poor immigration policy. Without significant reforms to stem immigration, the United States will struggle to maintain long-term competitiveness and achieve near-term technology priorities such as semiconductor supply chain security, leadership in AI, and clean energy innovation. We are entering a period of accelerating need for human talent. America's immigration policy is heavily weighted toward reuniting families. Other countries, such as Canada, have an immigration policy focused on attracting highly educated and skilled migrants for entry into the workforce. Many countries adopt this practice and are making immigration rules more flexible to attract needed talent. We see large numbers of foreign students in American universities and graduate schools, but all of them are in the United States on student visas or limited work visas. There is no fast track to a green card for highly capable and desirable student visa holders. America's high-tech industry has complained for many years about the constraints it faces due to the limited availability of H-1B visas. Recently, the congressionally chartered National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence called for a massive increase in educational training domestically in AI, as well as for a major program to recruit more AI talent from other countries. The United States is in a global competition for talent, and current U.S. immigration policies are a significant roadblock to competing internationally for this talent. The United States maintains a bewildering number of visa categories for everything from an athlete coming to a competition in the United States, to temporary agricultural workers following seasonal harvest requirements, to physicians. This discussion focuses specifically on permanent immigrant workers, green card holders, and temporary non-immigrant visas. Develop a dynamic trade policy. In February 2021, the SIZE Trade Commission on Affirming American Leadership issued a series of reports on why trade is vital for America's future growth and strengthening America's broader values in the world of international commerce. Over the latter half of the 20th century, the United States championed the expansion of global trade as a means of advancing U.S. interests in growing its domestic economy and in expanding international markets for its goods. China's rise, including both the expansion of China's industrial labor force and its adroit navigation between World Trade Organization rules, pose significant challenges to the existing WTO-centered system. The current system is far from perfect. It was developed at a time when issues such as the digital economy, climate change, and rent-seeking by the world's second-largest economy were hard to imagine. Dispute evaluation and resolution mechanisms now take longer than the market cycles they intend to correct. Reforms and updates are nearly impossible in a consensus-based organization comprising 164 members. Rather than retreating from the WTO and ceding standards setting there to China's autocratic economic model, the United States should reinvigorate efforts to drive forward a WTO based on U.S. interests and advantages. These include transparency, fair and market-based competition, and common global rules for trade. A roadmap exists for what the United States should do to reinvigorate trade in a manner consistent with U.S. values and domestic interests. It starts by working with a subset of like-minded countries to commit to a compact reflecting a more ambitious approach to trade rules, with the aim of bolstering rather than replacing the WTO. In addition to deepening trade ties, Compact members should identify and implement means to counter non-market economic practices. Compact members should also engage in discussions on leveraging trade to reduce the impact of climate change and on best practices to mitigate trade's disruptive impact on workers and on trade's potential to improve working conditions. Title 4: Competing more effectively with China on the global stage. Overview of U.S. foreign assistance. At the outset of the Cold War, the United States understood that it was in direct competition with the Soviet Union in presenting a development model to former European colonies around the world that had recently become independent states. America took comprehensive steps to strengthen its agenda in this global competition, including creating the United Nations and the Bretton Woods organizations like the World Bank. The United States also has created a range of institutions and programs at the federal level to help guide and support new leaders of young nations with weak economies and limited depth of talent for administering a country. The following list includes key U.S. institutions that have worked to develop stronger economies and more effective governments in developing countries. Economic and financial aid. U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID is an independent agency of the U.S. government with primary responsibility for administering civilian foreign aid and development assistance. USAID's budget for operating expenses and capital investment in FY 2023 was $2.08 billion. U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, provides financing and insurance for private companies developing economic projects in developing markets. The DFC underwrote $7.4 billion of projects in FY 2022 and currently administers over $9.3 billion of ongoing investments. The DFC returns a profit to the United States. Millennium Challenge Corporation, established in 2004, the MCC focuses on economic growth, poverty alleviation, and institution strengthening in low-income countries. Based on a rigorous, competitive application process, the MCC prioritizes creating sustainable impact in partner countries while delivering a return on investment for U.S. taxpayers. U.S. Trade and Development Agency, the USTDA, works to promote U.S. job creation through assisting U.S. firms to export goods and services for infrastructure projects in low-income countries. It funds feasibility studies, technical assistance, and pilot projects at early stages in foreign countries, better positioning partner countries to understand the advantages of working with U.S. firms. Fulbright Program. In FY 2020, the Fulbright program sent more than 2,500 Americans overseas for research and teaching and brought more than 4,000 of the world's brightest to the United States to study and engage. Over 75 years, the program has connected many thousands of people around the world to the United States and given Americans deeper understanding and enduring relationship advantages around the world. Peace Corps. The Peace Corps was created in 1961 as a permanent federal agency within the State Department, and in 1981 it became an independent agency. It was established as a way to more actively involve Americans in the cause of global democracy, peace, development, and freedom. Since its inception, the Peace Corps has sent over 200,000 Americans to serve in 139 countries. U.S. Information Agency. The U.S. Information Agency was established in 1953 to promote U.S. messages abroad, especially into the Soviet Union and aligned countries. Many of its functions were consolidated into the U.S. Department of State, especially the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy, before the agency was closed in 1999. U.S. Agency for Global Media. The U.S. Agency for Global Media oversees U.S.-funded programming abroad, including 6 media organizations, such as the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe/Radio Liberty. In 2022, it reached a global audience of 410 million people weekly with programming in 63 languages, supported by an $885 million appropriation. Both the Department of Commerce and the Department of State have created major undersecretaries designed to promote American businesses working internationally. All of these various efforts have been successful. Generally, the world America wanted to create following World War II, a world dominated by Western commercial and political values, has come to pass. The country has championed independence, representative government structures, and open markets as normative goals for the rising world. The government has encouraged major American foundations and universities to establish programs to accelerate leadership development in these countries. But with the passage of time, America became distracted by security issues that came to dominate U.S. international engagement policies. This is evident when we look at American development funding for various regions. American foreign assistance has largely reflected the primary political agenda confronting the United States at any particular time. The United States provided considerable aid assistance to Europe between 1946 and 1955. This was the start of the Cold War, when America launched the Marshall Plan to jumpstart the rebuilding of European economies. When the Soviet Union started to implode and ultimately collapse, there was a modest increase in spending for Europe. Foreign assistance to South and Central Asia became considerable as the confrontation with China increased and during U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam. That funding ended sharply in 1975. Development assistance to Central and South America paralleled the threat perceived there by Cuba in the mid-1960s and the U.S. effort to contain radicalism in the Americas. That tapered off, only to be boosted in the 1980s in the so-called war on drugs. The last spike in spending in the 2000s involved Plan Colombia, a coordinated effort to keep Colombia from disintegrating into a narco-state. Sub-Saharan Africa saw a significant boost in spending during the second half of the Bush administration in the early 2000s, when the United States devoted considerable resources to the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief. That funding has remained high through commitments of resources for Feed the Future. In the Middle East and North Africa, two developments largely account for U.S. assistance. The first was the result of the end of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, when the United States committed to providing significant defense resources on an ongoing basis to Israel and Egypt. The most recent spike reflects spending on economic development in Afghanistan and Iraq following the invasion of both countries. In short, this abbreviated survey shows that U.S. foreign assistance has largely been shaped by urgent geopolitical objectives that have evolved over time. Development funding was an extension of our overall political agenda. The United States has significantly increased assistance when a crisis, or perceived crisis, has developed and then cut it back to shift focus to other priorities. Our original goal to use American foreign assistance to build a structural world favorable to our strategic interests evolved into a tactical complement to a broader foreign policy. Our focus on new states struggling to develop took a back seat over time. The new competition with China in the global south. In recent years, U.S. policymakers have increasingly complained about China's rising influence in Africa and South America. It is important to put this in context. China has made a priority of courting countries in the global south. China has been actively building projects throughout the southern hemisphere. It is often noted that these projects represent opportunities for Chinese workers, not local workers. Still, China has made significant investments throughout Africa and increasingly in South America. These investments are paralleled by active diplomacy. President Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, through which China has loaned over $1 trillion to countries to pay for major infrastructure projects. Many of those projects were launched without adequate economic analysis, and China now finds itself as a major creditor country with loans that cannot be paid without significant restructuring. China generally does not forgive debt. This has had a dampening effect on China's willingness to finance massive projects and on the willingness of receiving countries to take on large loads of debt. Much of the debt sustainability crisis facing the global south is directly attributable to BRI projects. Still, the BRI has created pathways of influence for China in the global south. For 34 years, China has convened the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which has become the premier conference bringing African heads of state to Beijing. President Xi invariably spends days personally with these African leaders, collectively and individually, throughout the conference. By contrast, America's history of engagement in Africa is very uneven and rarely at presidential levels. To his credit, President Biden hosted a conference for African heads of state, but it stands out as a rare exception for an American president. More importantly, China has made major commercial inroads in the global south. In 1980, the primary trading partners for South American countries were the United States and Europe. Where there was active trade in Africa, it was generally with Europe. By 2018, China had become a dominant trade partner for much of Africa and a good portion of South America, not to mention all of Southeast Asia. China has had an integrated strategy to build infrastructure that supports its own commercial activities in these countries. This commercial and development activity has had a significant impact. American and European government leaders were surprised at how many African countries abstained in the UN votes to condemn Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. This is not to say that these African countries supported Russia's invasion. Rather, it points to a perception that this is a geopolitical matter between the developed West and Russia, and that the global South does not need to involve itself in Northern Hemisphere geopolitics. In short, China has had an integrated strategy to advance its influence in the global south, while the United States has no strategy. Critically, while the United States has struggled to sustain a consistent focus in its development policies, China has been stealing the march. The United States development agenda now tends to reflect domestic political priorities and controversies, not a grounded interest in building the economies of countries in the global south. The United States' inconsistency has been countered by an integrated Chinese strategy that has entailed significant commercial and development investments in all three major regions of the global south. This points to another fundamental observation: economic development has shifted from aid to trade, and from pilot projects to direct investments. China is doing far better in this new dimension of development than the United States. The United States has used development funding to pursue important social goals, while China has used its financial resources to build access to stronger markets. As a president of an African country noted to one of the authors of this report, "China gives us money, and you give us lectures." The United States and Europe do not need to duplicate China's mercantile policies to be effective, but they do need to change their thinking about the problem. America has not had an effective trade policy for a number of years. Protectionism has been more dominant in U.S. trade policy than global economic growth. In the early years of the Cold War, the United States saw the clear need to help newly emerging countries grow and prosper and shape their economic preferences for the U.S.-inspired Bretton Woods system. The infrastructure of the United States' soft power agenda remains in place, but the world has changed. The United States does not have a trade policy designed to draw African and South American countries increasingly into Western commercial orbits. Indeed, for several disastrous years, Congress blocked the work of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, now replaced by the DFC. America needs to return to the vision we championed in the early days of the Cold War. At that time, policymakers understood that the United States was competing against an alternative vision of economic development. The country is in this competition again, but with a far more capable opponent. America believes in free markets and competition. China believes in managed democracy, government-controlled markets, and preferential treatment of favored Chinese firms. African and South American governments are trying to improve the material lives of their citizens. The United States firmly believes that its model is superior, but it is failing to prioritize economic growth in African and South American countries as a key policy objective. If the United States is to succeed in the great competition with China in the global south, it needs to shift its focus to promoting economic growth, commercial development, and trade. This can be most vividly illustrated by looking at Africa. African states have a combined population of approximately 1.4 billion people today, and given the exponential birth rates on the continent, this number will surge to nearly 4 billion by the end of the century. The majority of its economies are still considered low income. Studies have shown that birth rates around the world almost invariably drop to replacement level or lower once GDP per capita reaches about $10,000. High birth rates in low-income economies is but one example of further intensified environmental and climatic demand pressures that the world will be facing in future. It is a known fact that developed countries plus China have contributed the most to carbon loading in the atmosphere to the present day. These countries are increasingly making major commitments to transition from carbon-based to renewable energy sources, though their actions to date fall short of what is required to meet the goals set in the COP process. In addition, such commitments are counteracted by the increasing energy demands associated with rapid and unmanaged population growth. It is crucial to recognize that Africa is not to blame. The African continent has every right to become prosperous, and economic growth directly depends on affordable energy resources. However, the developed world has no effective program to offer lower-income countries that seek economic development. Under current trends, said development will inevitably cause continued high consumption of fossil fuels. Continued high consumption of hydrocarbon-based energy will only heighten the water crisis that is now spanning the world. As African economies grow, we will see significant increases in urban populations and even greater stress on water and energy resources. In short, the global environment and America's future well-being will be directly affected by boosting prosperity in Africa, responsibly managing population growth, and mitigating the negative consequences of increasing energy and water use. Title 5: Climate Change and Energy Security. Fossil fuels and energy consumption today. Global energy consumption is highly correlated with economic growth. Indeed, the availability of lower-cost energy largely drove the Industrial Revolution and has led to an astounding increase in per capita incomes across the world. Energy consumption has grown dramatically worldwide over the past 60 years, but it is now causing great challenges because of the impacts on climate change. Scientists have estimated that global temperatures will continue to inexorably rise because of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere caused by the burning of hydrocarbon-based fuels. Governments around the world have pledged to reduce consumption of the primary hydrocarbon fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. The war in Ukraine has presented both good and bad news in this regard. Threatened by Russia's aggressive posture, Europe has launched major investments in advancing renewable energy sources. For the first time, European energy policies are more closely matched with European energy promises in the Conference of the Parties process of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But the war's immediate threat to energy supplies caused an enormous spike in prices of natural gas and has driven world consumption of coal to an all-time high. Developing countries do not have the same capacity as Europe and the United States to massively subsidize conversions to renewable energy. Consequently, fossil fuel demand will remain very high for at least the next 30 years. Fossil fuel consumption will go down somewhat after 2030 but will remain at 90% of the peak established in 2030. The leftmost scenario represents the current policies of all governments. The middle scenario represents the commitments governments have made at COP conferences, which are not yet fully reflected in national policies. The rightmost scenario represents what steps would be required to meet net zero by 2050. Renewable energy resources are rising impressively, but fossil fuel consumption remains high due to current government policies. A primary reason fossil fuel consumption rates remain high is because populations in emerging and developing countries in the global south are growing dramatically and remain relatively poor, while hydrocarbon energy resources are currently relatively affordable. As countries grow richer, citizens seek a higher quality of life, and this often means air cooling for homes and offices, a trend that climate change will accelerate, and personal transportation. Currently, about 80% of the global population without access to electricity, roughly 600 million people, lives in Africa, where electricity is overwhelmingly required for cooling. Currently, 5 billion people globally live in regions that require cooling, but only 1/3 of these individuals have air conditioners. As climate change intensifies, the number of people who need cooling is anticipated to grow to 7 billion. Today, there are 1.5 billion air conditioners, and that number is expected to grow to 4.4 billion by 2050, driving much higher consumption of electricity, particularly because the air conditioners that most people can afford to buy are not very energy efficient. There has been astounding progress in the efficiency and cost of photovoltaic solar power generation, but photovoltaic power generation and wind power are still intermittent sources. They work well in smaller scale settings, but are difficult to scale to larger grid networks. Urbanization will heighten demand for reliable electricity, and at present, this is most likely to be met through carbon-based electricity generating facilities. We need accelerated economic growth in developing countries to allow for better resource management. However, increased personal wealth will lead to greater demand for energy, and achieving economic prosperity depends on affordable energy resources. Under current trends, these countries will repeat the unfortunate patterns set by high-income economies that developed at the expense of the environment. Resurgent interest in nuclear power generation. The persistent high demand for fossil fuel power generation has again prompted interest in nuclear power. Nuclear power generation does not emit carbon dioxide or other gases that cause greenhouse gas effects in the atmosphere. climate and energy security considerations have led several countries to adopt new strategies for energy security that involve nuclear energy. South Korea and Belgium have altered plans to retire existing nuclear production facilities. Japan has again restarted shuttered generation plants and plans to replace older nuclear generating facilities. Poland, Saudi Arabia, Slovakia, and the United Kingdom have plans on the books to build new generating facilities. Nuclear power has been plagued by high construction costs, serious cost overruns, and construction delays. This has led to a significant interest in small modular reactors. Currently, there are a dozen companies developing designs for small generators that would range from 30 to 350 megawatts of power generation. Theoretically, these facilities would not require the extensive and expensive construction costs of larger reactors and can still incorporate designs that ensure safety, but to date, the promise of small modular reactors is more aspirational than a likely reality. Since 2017, construction has begun on 31 new large-scale reactors. However, all but 4 of them are being designed and built by either Russia or China. Herein lies a great concern. Commercial nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Commercial nuclear power generation is invariably the foundation for a nuclear weapons program. Countries have developed nuclear weapons without commercial generation facilities, but invariably countries develop the expertise to manage nuclear weapons and generate fissile materials when undertaking commercial nuclear power programs. This was understood when the Eisenhower administration launched the now famous Atoms for Peace program, announced at the UN General Assembly back in 1953. President Eisenhower and his advisors understood the enormous potential positive benefit of nuclear power as a generating source for electricity, but also knew the danger posed by nuclear weapons. This led the United States to take the lead to develop a comprehensive architecture of controls to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The United States encouraged the development of commercial nuclear power under the strict surveillance of an independent UN agency, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which was established in 1957. IAEA inspectors travel around the world monitoring the nuclear power programs in 30 of the 32 countries that currently operate commercial nuclear power plants. North Korea was included until 2002, when it kicked out IAEA inspectors as it set out on its current path of building nuclear weapons. This then led to the establishment of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, commonly called the NPT. The NPT had 3 pillars. The first pillar committed all signatory states to not starting nuclear weapon programs and to accepting IAEA safeguard inspections to ensure that their nuclear programs conform to peaceful commercial power goals. The second pillar committed the countries that possessed nuclear weapons to getting rid of them. There is considerable criticism of nuclear weapon states for not following through on this commitment. At the time the NPT entered into force, there were only 5 acknowledged nuclear weapon states: China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Israel has long been a nuclear weapon state and has refused IAEA safeguards. India and Pakistan subsequently developed nuclear weapons but eventually agreed to IAEA safeguard inspections. North Korea had been an IAEA signatory but withdrew from the NPT treaty in 2003 and expelled all IAEA surveillance systems in order to develop nuclear weapons capabilities. While other countries have toyed with covert weapons programs, notably Syria, Iran, and Libya, generally the NPT has effectively limited the spread of nuclear weapons. The third pillar of the NPT treaty authorizes the peaceful use of nuclear energy for commercial and research purposes. Of the 32 countries that have commercial nuclear power plants, only 9 countries currently have nuclear weapons. It is strongly in America's interests to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. The NPT has been reasonably successful in establishing norms of transparency and accountability that have limited the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But now we must return to the key fact that since 2017, 31 new nuclear reactor programs have been started, and 27 of them involve Russia and China. Russia and China were signatories to the NPT, but they have never been active champions of the IAEA or of non-proliferation. China actively aided Pakistan in developing its nuclear weapons, and Russia is now actively collaborating with North Korea, but it is unclear if this involves North Korea's nuclear program. The burden of sustaining the NPT was largely carried by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, joined by Germany and Japan. The International Energy Agency says it politely, advanced economies have lost market leadership in commercial nuclear technology. It goes on to explain that despite having nearly 70% of global nuclear capacity, investment has stalled, and the latest projects have run far over budget and behind schedule. America's commercial nuclear power industry has substantially deteriorated. For 15 years, the United States has had to import enriched material from other countries, though recent legislation has provided funds to restart enrichment in the United States. The United States retains design teams but largely contracts for pressure vessel construction from Japan. Advocacy for commercial nuclear power has been weak over the past 2 decades, largely because of the cost, and cost overruns for new plants have damaged the commercial viability of nuclear power generation. We are now seeing encouraging signs of stronger interest in commercial nuclear energy, though price signals in the marketplace remain a major impediment to fielding a new generation of reactors. Reasons to again promote commercial nuclear energy. The United States now has 3 compelling reasons to promote a resurgence of commercial nuclear energy. The first is the need for non-carbon power generation. Once in operation, nuclear power plants emit no greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Second, due to its past significant commercial nuclear power industry, America has developed gold standards for safety and security for operating commercial plants. And third, America needs to stay active in commercial nuclear power to sustain its leadership of the non-proliferation architecture. These goals are existential and require active American leadership on commercial nuclear power. Conclusion: America's success has been astounding, by any measure. The vast majority of Americans today live better than did Queen Victoria. Only 150 years ago, Americans today have far superior medical care, warmer clothes and houses, ubiquitous and inexpensive entertainment, and far more comfortable transportation. This is not meant to minimize the inequality in America, nor the country's scandalously high levels of hunger and poverty despite being the richest country in the world. But the human condition in the world, and especially in the United States, has improved dramatically. The astounding improvement in the human condition over the last 70 years is a direct byproduct of the way the United States championed an open, liberal economic order and promoted liberalized trade during this period. This growth accelerated amid globalization, when geopolitical tensions were diminished and new global supply chains and markets flourished. But as they say in the world of public investing, past performance is not a guarantee of future returns. We are facing a challenging time. America has fractured domestic politics, a divided electorate, disappointing public education performance, and frightening new technologies for which the government has no reliable framework for protecting the public. And the United States faces a formidable competitor on the global stage that offers a compelling narrative to a significant portion of the global population. This narrative suggests that Americans either take them for granted or, even worse, exploit them. The United States does need a new strategy for this era, but it has a remarkable foundation for success well within its grasp. The United States' driving goal is to survive as a nation and to prosper as a people. America certainly has all that it takes to do that. The purpose of this monograph is not to delineate the intricate dimensions of a new national strategy. That requires the full commitment and efforts of hundreds or thousands of leaders in the United States. It rather offers a simple reflection of what challenges the American people face and what principles should guide the country going forward. This monograph attempts to outline a broad framework to guide the hard work of developing detailed policies and plans. Recounted here in summary form are the basic elements of this framework. 1. The United States must retain a strong military establishment capable of anticipating and addressing potential future challenges. The country has a strong establishment now, but it needs to become more efficient in its deliberations and strategic planning. Retaining a strong military will require serious streamlining and reform. 2. The United States still needs to play a leading role in shaping the global policy landscape to facilitate its accomplishment of national objectives. This means actively investing in stronger international institutions capable of managing complex modern problems. In addition, it must increase investment in alliances and partnerships with countries that share the same fundamental values. These alliances, partnerships, and institutions add strategic depth to U.S. national capacities, making it easier to manage an increasingly complex set of challenges. 3. America needs a growth strategy for its economy. Without significant expansion, Americans will contend to fight over a shrinking pie. It is crucial that we foster growth and ensure that the benefits are more evenly spread to establish a self-reinforcing economy. By prioritizing an agenda focused on growth, other problems in the country will be easier to address. Without ample economic growth, all problems will be harder to solve. 4. To grow the economy, the U.S. government must bolster its commitment toward the expansion and success of the private sector. The United States needs to take a more active role in helping the private sector lead in setting global standards. The country needs to reform and fortify the intellectual property protection system. It also needs to ameliorate the immigration system to recruit more highly qualified people to expand the talent pool in the country and assist it in competing more effectively on the global stage. We also need serious reform of regulatory processes to remove the impediment of investing in the United States compared to investing in other countries. 5. The United States needs one comprehensive trade policy, for 2 reasons. First, such a strategy is the best way to widen the appeal and efficacy of a rules-based international order, which is fundamentally in America's national interests. Second, the government needs to boost economic growth, both here in the United States and around the world. The vast growth in American prosperity and in prosperity around the world in recent decades was the product of increasing international trade. Today, the Global South perceives that America champions the international rules-based order to protect its privilege and amplify its growth at the expense of developing countries. The best way to reverse the perception is to create a vibrant trade agenda that prioritizes growth here and abroad. 6. It is particularly important to support the economic development of low-income countries in the Global South. These nations will become customers of U.S. goods and services. More importantly, this presents an effective approach to curbing unmanaged population growth while addressing the challenges of economic migration that is presently confounding Europe and the United States. At the start of the Cold War, U.S. leaders understood that helping other countries become more prosperous was going to be good for America for both economic and security reasons. 7. If we are to address climate change effectively, the United States must deal with the reality of explosive population growth in the developing world and the comparably rising demands for energy. That means that the United States needs to shift its thinking on development from aid to trade. We also need to support these countries in their efforts to find development paths that are less exploitative and damaging to the environment. 70 years ago, bringing economic growth and development to African, Asian, and Middle East countries was central to the U.S. strategy to win the Cold War. Now it is likely essential to win the battle against climate change. 8. America again needs to champion nuclear power. American leadership produced the credibility to shape a global system of rules and norms to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. America's ambivalence now about nuclear energy could cede the international market to Russia and China, neither of which is a champion of non-proliferation. Expanding commercial nuclear power would also make a major contribution to reducing reliance on carbon-based sources of electricity. This is not a strategy but a framework that can guide the development of detailed plans to secure the future of the United States as a nation and ensure the prosperity of American citizens. The country finds itself once again in an era of strategic competition. Our primary competitor, China, possesses capabilities far exceeding those of the Soviet Union. While this is not Cold War 2.0, It is a competition between alternative philosophies of governance. There is a large segment of American society that is looking for sensible direction for a stronger future. There is no reason that the 21st century should not be the American century. However, that will only happen with pragmatic and constructive approaches to our shared future.